We are continuing our discussion on this well-known introductory work on Advaita Vedanta, the Vivekachudamani of Shankaracharya. So we are discussing the concept of Sukshma Sharira, or called subtle body. So we have to keep in mind the 7 questions asked by a disciple to a teacher. That is the 51st verse of this text. So the entire text is built around these 7 questions and answers to these 7 questions. The 7 questions are: Ko nama bandha, kathamesha agataha, katham pradishtha asya, katham vimokshaha, kosau anatma, paramakka atma, tayor viveka kathameda uchyadam. The first question is, what is bondage? So what is the bondage? What is the idea of bondage? Is this physical life enjoying worldly objects, worldly sensual pleasures? Is that all that we can conceive of as a supreme goal in life? No, there is something higher than the physical, higher than the worldly enjoyments. So when we feel we are trapped into this world of sensual enjoyments, that state of existence is called the bondage. That is bandha. So what is bondage? What's the nature of bondage? And then, how did it come about? Kathamesha agataha. These are all 7 questions which, not only in philosophy, even in our everyday life we can ask ourselves. These questions are not about worshipping God in a temple or a church or praying to God, but rather to use our own skills, our own reasoning power, our own intelligence to understand the dynamics of human life, its ultimate goal, what's the purpose, is there something higher than everyday experience of worldly enjoyments? So that's the question. Katham pradishtha asya, where it is founded. Again, how to get out of it. What do you call it? So theology means a concept of liberation, ultimate enlightenment, liberating oneself from this bondage. Again, koso anatma. So what is the absolute reality and what is that which is not absolute? Anatma. Paramakka atma, what is the absolute reality? Paramatma. Tayor viveka kathamet uchyadam. How to distinguish, how to use the reasoning power, discerning power to understand the real from the unreal. These are 7 questions. So the entire text is built around these 7 questions. So the teacher is addressing the 5th question, Koso anatma. What is that which is non-atman? Non-atman or anatman mentioned here is not the same thing as used in Buddhism. So we have to remember this. Anatta is a very important concept in Buddhism. In Pali it is called anatta or non-atman. So the meaning of anatma in Buddhism is this: there is nothing in this empirical phenomenal world that is permanent, that will be existing all the time. Everything in this empirical phenomena is only impermanent. It doesn't have its own independent, permanent existence, including our own body, which is changing. So everything is changing. It's called kshanikata, momentariness. So that momentariness implies the absence of anything permanent in this world. That's the actual philosophical meaning of anatta in Buddhism. We are discussing Buddhism for the last almost 30-40 sessions in our foundational text of Indian philosophy classes for the university. So these 7 questions and 7 answers. So the teacher addressed the first question later, not at the beginning. At the beginning, he is addressing the fifth question, Koso Anatma. So what about this world? So if you go on analyzing the nature of this world, you can think of everything in this world, beginning with our own physical body, the cells, which are changing all the time, the air and water, the ocean, the trees and mountains, all living beings, they are subject to changes. So anything if it is subject to change cannot be called permanent, cannot claim any independent, permanent, unchanging existence. It's called non-Atman in Advaita. So in Advaita tradition, the physical body, that is the gross body, this body and all that constitutes the physical outer shell of our personality is non-Atman, means impermanent, subject to changes, not really the absolute sense, not absolute reality. And again, the Sukshma Sharira, which is called subtle body in English. So gross body is Sthula Sharira, physical body. Sukshma Sharira is subtle body. Sukshma Sharira implies what we are minus our body system. Mind, thoughts, emotions, feelings, the ideals, the values that we practice in our life, the ideals that we stand for in our life, which actually is your real personality going beyond what is seen outside, that is Sukshma Sharira. That we already explained. So these two bodies already explained. Now we are going to discuss Karana Sharira. Karana Sharira means the actual cause. Karana means cause. The actual cause of all this bondage. The real cause for this bondage is that we forget our true nature and we identify with something which is not our true nature. We identify ourselves with this body and all. Every human being, normally in our everyday life, we would say I am walking, I am talking, all this relates to the gross body, the Sthula Sharira. I'm eating food, drinking water, all these are different activities at the level of physical body. And then you think of great men, great women in the world. They are no more there. They passed away maybe 2000 years ago. You may remember Jesus Christ who passed away close to 2000 years ago. Buddha who passed away 2500, 450 years ago. So we still remember Buddha. When you think of Buddha, you don't think of his physical body. We don't know how he looked like physically. You know his photo. But something comes to our mind. Buddha, a man, somebody who stood for compassion, humanism, all these great values. So you think of Christ, somebody who stood for something. You don't remember how his body looked like. But then we have an idea of what he was like. Or Shankaracharya, who lived in 8th century AD, the great philosopher, saint, considered to be an incarnation in the tradition. Vivekachudamani, who passed away in 1902. Sri Ramakrishna, who passed away in 1886. Great men, great women, we still remember them. And we admire them not for what they looked like physically, but what they lived for, what values they practiced. So that is nothing but the Sukshma Sharira or subtle body. As I mentioned, our subtle body consists of our emotions and feelings and thoughts, samskaras, tendencies, what we recollect, what we consider to be our supreme goal in our life. All these constitute our Sukshma Sharira. Sharira means body, Sukshma means subtle, not visible, but you can feel it. You know, you can go to a library, read a book of a great saint, You may not see him because he passed away 2000 years ago, like Buddha, but still when you read his life, when you read about his teachings, something emerges in your mind. And that is the personality of a man who was compassionate, who practiced some higher values in life. So that is his personality. It's not the body that goes to the tube and disappears into ashes in a crematorium. That's a body that never disappears. So that subtle body continues to inspire, teach and lead civilizations, humanity, nations, people for thousands of years. That is Sukshma Sarira. And now we are going to Karana Sarira, the causal body. What is the Karana Sarira? Why do we mistake ourselves to be this physical body? What's the reason for it? So that's the real cause. Our absence of knowledge of our true nature. We are not aware of what we actually are. We are ignorant of our true nature. That is called avidya, maya, mithya. In their implications, different terms are used in Advaita Vedanta. Avidya means something, you may call it ignorance, but avidya, so if you read a book like this, you may say ignorance. And you go to a dictionary with thesaurus, Oxford, Chambers, Webster, and you read the meaning of ignorance. This ignorance is not the cause of absence of understanding of true nature. That is true. So it is not the intellectual implication of the word ignorance. It is something much deeper and much more subtle. That's what we are going to find out. It is the natural absence of our true nature that we are born with, which becomes the cause of all the problems in our life. If we can know, we can be aware of the fact that we are Atman, then we cannot become greedy, we cannot become cruel, we cannot become evil, we cannot have jealousy or competition or nothing. Because then we understand the same Atman, same divine spark is present everywhere in everything. So that understanding, the realization, gives you an idea that entire creation is one spiritual family. Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, the Mahabharata means, Vasudha means the earth, humanity. Kudumbakam means family. The entire creation is one family. That idea comes to us when we realize the supreme truth. Now, and that actual cause of all our misunderstandings is called Maya, Avidya, Mithya, and so on. Some of them are real names given, Avidya or Maya, but all these are explained in the subsequent verses. So, those of you who got the text, we can just turn to the verse number 110. Description of Karana Sarira. Avyakta Namni Paramesha Shakti Anadi Avidya Trigunatmika Para Karyanumeya Sudhaiva Maya Yaya Jagat Sarvamidam Prasuyati. So, this avidya, now if you get a verbal word for word translation, we may not get the full implication of what this avidya is. So, as I mentioned, the translation may be ignorance, and the meaning of ignorance is absence of knowledge. It is not knowledge at the intellectual level, at the experience level. So, avidya is not absence of intellectual understanding. It is a state in which we are living without awareness as to what our true nature is. That state is called avidya. Now, it doesn't have a form. It doesn't have a specific, verifiable dimension in terms of words, name and form or any qualities or characteristics. So it is called avyakta. Namni means name is avyakta. Avyakta means something that doesn't have a form, that doesn't have a name. But I can give an example. As I mentioned, all the problems that we face in this world, greed, for example, is an essential characteristic of this modern industrial culture and this utilitarian culture in which we live with the full conviction that everything should have a practical utility value that is immediately to be experienced. And that leads to greed. And greed is because we don't know true nature. When we don't know our true nature, we think profit, money, success, all these constitute the only goal of in human existence. Greed doesn't have a form. It doesn't have a name also. But people become victims of greed, anger. All these different aspects of human emotions, they exist because of our lack of awareness of our true nature. So like that, certain characteristics that we are part of, that unfortunately we happen to practice, but doesn't have a name. Jealousy doesn't have a name. Greed doesn't have a name. Anger doesn't have a name. But it happens because of avidya, because of absence of our true nature. That's called avyakta namni. Paramesha Shakti. Now, this is a term that's very difficult to understand unless you have studied Vedanta in greater detail. Some of you are already familiar with some of the earlier books. Paramesha Shakti means God's power. That's the literal meaning. So, the point is, where does it come from? It's not God's gift. Anger is not God's gift. But that's how the world is created, how human beings are normally made, because they are not aware of their true nature. Then they should make effort to practice higher values, then they should turn to spirituality, then they come to know their true nature. So, this whole dynamics, after all, one may ask this question, why should God create this unpleasant world? All these problems, COVID-19, and then earthquakes, all these terrible things which are part of nature. Why should a compassionate, kind-hearted God create this cruel world? There is no real answer in Vedanta. The answer is found in Abrahamic religions. We can say God one day created this world. But that answer is not acceptable in higher philosophy. So Vedanta, of course, it accepts the idea of God, created God, but goes beyond that. Well, Vedanta puts the whole blame and responsibility in our own shoulders. So Vedanta tells you, well, you live in this world and find out your true nature. And in your effort to find out your own true nature, you become a good human being. We already discussed the 19th verse, some of the essential characteristics of every spiritual seeker who turns to Vedanta. You should first of all have an understanding of what is real, what is unreal. Then we should uphold the real, and then we should practice self-restraint, compassion, contentment, concentration, higher values. You should become broad-minded, you should become a good human being, and then you should have the supreme goal. We should have this strong urge for liberation from all this. Buddhists call them nirvana, to get out of this samsara, this bondage, this which constitutes human existence. And Vedanta call it moksha, liberation. In Abrahamic religion it's called God's grace, going to kingdom of heaven, or whatever it is. All these are different terms in the soteriological systems of different world religions, the concept of liberation, moksha. But Vedanta takes a different route. Vedanta tells you, well, you find out your own true nature. When you realize what your true nature is, then we will live in this world, but we have a higher ideal to guide our actions and thoughts and emotions. And then we realize that we have to understand our true nature. So Vedanta tells us that God is living in all of us, not as a human form, but as a divine spark, as a divine principle. God is immanent, calling Vedanta Antaryami, immanent in all of us. And we can bring out this God within us, how? By practicing some higher disciplines, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and so on. By practicing certain spiritual qualities. When we practice those qualities, this divinity that is there, that is sleeping within us, will start waking up. And you call them saints and sages. So Vedanta, according to Vedanta, all the great men and women who would turn their life for a higher purpose, they had this awakening coming to them within their hearts in different degrees. So this power is really a manifestation of God's power, designed to make us struggle hard to bring out this inner divinity by practicing spiritual disciplines. Anadi, Anadi means it doesn't have a origin. It doesn't have an origin. So there you have to remember this idea becomes clear only when we compare, for example, Adam eating the apple, those stories you find. So we became victims of ignorance. So all the problems started. But Vedanta gives a different answer. Vedanta says this ignorance, this lack of awareness, has no beginning, but it has an end. It is anadi pasanta, means it is without a beginning, but it has an end. When does it come to an end? When we realize our true nature. Anyone can do that. No matter whether, even without believing in God, you can do that. That's why Vedanta. So Vedanta is very interesting. And that's why in the words of great modern interpreters of Vedanta, like Vivekananda was a monk, Dr. Radhakrishnan was an academic philosopher. Anyone for that matter you take, in their ideas you take, you don't have to believe in a God to become a godly person. And Swami Vivekananda, pushing forward this idea, once said, you live your life in such a way that God will accept you even if you don't accept Him. So to become a good human being, that's the purpose of human purpose. So this happens when we get rid of this avidya, when we, by spiritual disciplines, by spiritual practices, we awaken this divinity that is already within. So it's not that the divinity is coming from outside. It's already there within. Just like, for example, when there is a bulb but not giving enough light because there's a dark dust or something around. You remove that, the light comes out. The light doesn't come from outside. Only the obstacle that stood in the way of the light coming out, you removed. So that's the whole purpose of all spiritual disciplines. So prayers, rituals, confessions, puja, worship, reading scriptures, listening to higher ideas, all these are different spiritual disciplines. The ultimate purpose is to become a good human being. And when you become a good human being, the divinity within comes out. So there are two ways of understanding. One way of understanding is, when this awakening happens, it happens gradually, not all of a sudden. When this happens, we feel kind of inner contentment, inner joy, inner serenity. It is not happiness. It is not happiness in its ordinary superficial sense. We are happy. One may be happy if he gets money, higher job, a promotion, unhappy when he loses everything. But this contentment is something different, something higher than happiness, unhappiness equation. So this inner sense of fulfillment is called this content. It is called santosha. You can find in the Gita, you find this santosha, this inner contentment is one important characteristic of a spiritually evolving person. And then when you feel the inner contentment, all others around you also feel happy. They don't feel threatened that you'll force them into some other. No. That is an important characteristic of any spiritual person. You don't feel threatened, oh, this fellow is very spiritual, I should run away from him. That is not spirituality, it is worse than atheism. Better to be a non-believer than a believer who causes terror all over the world. So, one important characteristic are the inner sense of fulfillment, and externally everyone around you feel you are a person who is not up to any trouble, who is helpful, is a compassionate human. That's all the great saints and sages in any tradition for the matter. Truly spiritual persons were never a problem in their neighborhood. And also, they had this inner feeling of joy, contentment. When I said this, I put this idea in another context, the interfaith program, interfaith with different religious traditions. Then they asked this question about Jesus Christ. The Christ was, being dragged around the streets of Jerusalem 2000 years ago with a heavy wooden cross on his shoulders. Not a very pleasant, happy experience. So you cannot say Christ was happy all the time, but Christ was not unhappy. Because he was not weeping and crying after unhappiness. He was experiencing a kind of inner joy. So Buddha was dying. And the Buddha died of accidentally eating meat which is poisoned. Buddhist monks had to accept. They are vegetarians, but they have to accept whatever they are given. That's a vow. Buddhist monks, ancient times. And then his disciples, Ananda and other disciples, Mahakashyapa and others came. He asked them, don't weep and cry. He was always in a joyful mood even while breathing his last. So that means this contentment goes beyond what we call joy or unhappiness in the dictionary sense. It is something much more profound. And then those around you also feel the serenity, the tranquility, the peace, the spirituality. So that's why this contentment, the inner fulfillment, and a sense of serenity that you spread outside. Another Trunatmika Spara. So this avidya, it manifests in triple characteristics: Sattva-guna, Rajo-guna, Tamo-guna. These are three important human characteristics that normally constitute our attitude, our mind, our emotions and feelings. When we are serene, calm and quiet, it becomes Sattva-guna. When you are active and involved and dynamic, it is Rajo-guna. When you are dull and inactive, it is called Tamo-guna. If you have got any doubts, because we discussed this many times on this platform, so we may not repeat right now, but you can always, you're free to ask questions for more elaboration, further description during the interaction. Karyanimeya Sudeva Maya. So, this Maya can only be inferred. You cannot see that. There's no form, no visible form no name, nothing, but we can feel this Maya. Well, one important thing. For example, at some point, every person may feel, well, this is not enough. Every noble, cultured person may feel at some point in his life, well, this experience, this birth, life and death and Vedanta and Buddhism called rebirth also is mentioned. It is not a very pleasant thing. There is something much more to human existence. But still something makes me bound to this world. And that cannot be seen, but it can only be inferred when we reach a higher level of intellectual, spiritual evolution. Actually, the idea of bondage or something imperfect about this world is a feeling that comes only to some advanced souls. Unless you are spiritually and intellectually more enlightened, you won't feel any dissatisfaction with the world of sensual enjoyments. Normal human beings who are not familiar with any higher idea, they are very happy with whatever they are getting, absolutely. But people who are more highly evolved, they stand apart and start thinking, well, what's the purpose of human existence? Is there something more to human life than this happiness and unhappiness, good and bad, pain and pleasure coming one after another by succession? Is there something more than that? So you go to library and read a book on philosophy. Or you may attend a program where a discussion is happening about something higher, something transcendental. So this happens only to people, even the ability to listen to these higher ideas without being bored, without running away from there. It is possible only when your mind is higher, slightly evolved. Otherwise, there are things in this world that are very sensational, very eye-catching. You will be drawn towards that. You can forget about time. So, this happens only for those who are highly evolved. And then, Jaya Jagat Sarvamidam Prasuyadi. And this world of name and form, worldly empirical experiences, it is a creation of this Maya. It's a creation of this strange, mysterious reality. You understand its true nature when you get out of it. So Maya is something. So then we can explain in simple language. This Maya means Ma, Ya. These are two letters, long vowel, Ma and Ya. Both are long vowel, two letters. Ma in Sanskrit language, when it's used, it implies negation. Ma gacchadu, don't go, ma gacchadu, don't come here. Don't, that's what it means. You are negating something. That is the literal meaning of ma. Ya is actually pronoun, feminine gender. So, Yastri, Swayam, Sugudinam, Bhavaneshwar, Lakshmi. Ya means it's a pronoun. Now, you don't use a pronoun with regard to something that doesn't exist. But it is not absolutely real, it doesn't exist, so use the word ma. So ma is something that negates things. And ya is a pronoun which you point out something. Yaha is masculine, ya long vowel is feminine. So ma, ya, when these words come together, what does it mean? It is something real, but actually not real. Real, let's say small letter R, then you write not real means not capital letter R, not real. So this world of enjoyments, empirical worldly phenomena, sensory enjoyments, all these things are real small letter r. Because we are seeing that, we cannot say the car doesn't exist, that is running the street, but the car will not exist after 200 years. So there is it exists only within a limited frame of time. And also the same thing doesn't exist all the time, everywhere. It is limited in time, space and causation. Everything relative in this world, the small letter r, real, it exists only in a relative sense. It's called apekshika satta, means vyavaka. Empirical reality. Buddhists call it loka samvruddhi satyam. In Sautrantika, realistic school of Buddhism, Hinayana system, and in Yogacara, which we are discussing now, which is called idealistic school of Buddhism. It is called, and Shunyavada also, Nagarjuna Shunyavada. It is called Loka Samvruddhi and Paramartha Satya. Loka Samvruddhi means the empirical, everyday experience. The implications are different in Sautrantika and Shunyavada, of course. So what it means is, all these are there, but they are not real in the absolute sense. In means they are not R capital letter, real in the absolute sense. They are only real, small letter r, in the relative sense. So that's why this world itself is called mithya in Vedanta. So this again is highly misleading. Unfortunately, many people who have no access to the scriptures, and they read some superficial translation. They say Advaita Vedanta, Hinduism tells you, you are not here, I am not here. This chair is not here, you are not sitting here. So that will make the whole thing absolutely ridiculous, absolutely stupid. What Vedanta tells you is, all these things are there, but only limited in time and space and causation, not absolutely real. Even the earth itself, as such, this earth, won't be the same after some billions of years. Maybe absolutely no chance for it to remain the same after some billions of years. It's totally different. The universe, what we call the universe itself, can change. Even if you move from one place to another, suppose the earth moves away from the sun little further, it will be global, not warming, the opposite of it. We have no sunlight. People will die of freezing. If the earth moves a little closer to the sun, there will be the temperature will be 1000 degrees centigrade. So everything in this world is designed to make it temporary, relative in the relative sense, real in the relative sense. So that is why Vedanta tells you this world is mithya. Mithya means relative or relativity. So, yaya jagat sarvamidam prasuyate. That's how this world is coming to existence. Then, in the next verse, that is a very celebrated verse, Swami Vivekananda, the founder of the Vedanta Society, Vivekananda founded this Vedanta Society in 1900. He came to this country to attend the Parliament of Religion in 1893, Chicago. So he literally translated this verse many times, and he included literal translation of this verse, 111th verse, in many of his speeches. It is sannapya sannapya ubhayatmigano, bhinnapya abhinnapya ubhayatmigano, sangapya anangapya ubhayatmigano, mahadbhuda anirvachaniya rupa. The Maya, which is cause of this world, this empirical world, is the great mystery. Anirvachaniya means that cannot be defined. If you want to define something, then you have to define in terms of certain characteristics, certain actions, certain qualities, certain associations, or certain comparisons. That's the only way you can define or describe anything in this world. You can say if you have seen an animal in the zoo, you don't know the name of it, when you tell your friend, you can say, it looked like a lion, you can say. You're comparing it. You don't know how to describe, But you try to describe in words, so what do? You compare it to something else that you already, that's well known. Or you have to describe a flower, you may call it a red flower, yellow flower, green flower, and so on, in terms of quality, okay, 10 characteristic, red color. If you let's say define or describe your friend, well, you can say he's a musician, artist. You're defining him, associating with some work he does. He's a musician, he does song, he composes music. Or you may define somebody, let's say, in terms of a relationship, association. You may say his uncle, your brother, and so on. So, when you decide to describe something or define something, you have to use certain criteria. It's called the 5 term conditions of verbalization. And surprisingly, those of you who have studied Christian theology, not modern theology, but the greatest name in Christian theological tradition was Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart, remember, the Meister Eckhart who lived in 13th century Germany, the great Dominican priest and mystic, one of the greatest names in Christian tradition. He said that God cannot even be defined as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. When you describe God in terms of Trinity is a blasphemy. That is a very radical doctrine preached by Meister Eckhart. I want to emphasize Meister Eckhart, remember, who lived in 13th century Germany. He was a great Advaitin. And remember, Shankaracharya, the author of this book, lived in the 8th century AD. Meister Eckhart again lived in 13th century Germany, almost 550 years after him. He said that God cannot be defined in terms of word or name and form. God is something beyond defines, descriptions and definitions. That's why Shankaracharya says, this mystery is something that's beyond description, beyond definition. Anyway, now we will have interaction for almost 10 minutes. You are most welcome to ask questions. And some of these ideas are new to many of you, some of them may be almost familiar. But I'd be happy to respond to questions if there are requests for giving more elaborate descriptions, or I shall continue the text. Most welcome. Thank you.
Swamiji, during this life cycle with the impermanence would indicate that there must be permanence. So, in the changeability of the individual and the environment and Mother Earth, is there a psychic spiritual compass to guide us into maybe the future incarnation, or a certain amount of spiritual security or wisdom that can guide us? Because if there's so much impermanence, where are we going?
Yeah. So that's right. No, what you said is true. The idea of something being impermanent cannot exist without the concept, without conceiving something that is permanent. The relative and absolute go together. But really speaking, absolute alone exists. The relative only is a relative manifestation of the absolute. Vedanta. The relative doesn't have its own existence. The relative is what we normally understand, that's what we normally live with, that's what we normally experience. And unfortunately, we always live under this wrong impression that the relative is the absolute. A person who doesn't have any higher concept in life, he may think enjoyment, that's only purpose of human existence. Enjoyment of worldly things. He has no idea of something beyond the empirical, beyond the world, beyond the experience of 3 minutes in our life. So, because for him only the relative exists. Those who are evolving, they have both absolute and relative. They are trying to make sense of the relative. And they alone start reading books, meditating, thinking seriously, discussing higher philosophy. And they only start practicing spiritual disciplines. It may be prayer, it may be meditation, it may be different spiritual disciplines, different traditions. Every religion, every faith system has its own traditions. But the absolute, the ultimate purpose of all spiritual disciplines is to understand the absolute. And when you understand the absolute, you understand absolute alone exists. What you called relative earlier was nothing but absolute. It's a limited understanding of the absolute. Limited in terms of time, space and causation. That relative understanding called Maya. So that's why the absolute seen through the prism of time, space and causation is the world. Absolute seen through, witnessed, understood in terms of time and space is the world. When you look at the world beyond time and space, then you are connecting with the absolute. I gave this example. Ramana Maharshi, the example, because there are many, but Ramana Maharshi is sitting there. Maybe, he's looking at something. So what is he looking at? He's not staring at something, but he's looking at, he has not closed his eyes. He's seeing this world not as this world. He's seeing this world as non-different from the absolute. And that is the characteristic of a liberated person. That is a super-conscious level. But before that, we normally begin our journey at the relative level, at the empirical level. That's the point. And what you said, I want to address that idea, the Mother Earth. So if you look upon this Mother Earth itself as a divine manifestation, instead of looking at Mother Earth as a place where you can do whatever you want, but as you are a guest to this earth. So if you play games with nature, nature will hit back. So you get all these global warming, tsunamis, all because nature is hitting back. Actually, you don't have to take care of nature. Nature will take care of you. If you are not very careful in dealing with nature. Nature has it's a natural way of, natural means spontaneous way of reacting against intuitions, nature. That's why in many of the faith systems, like the Native American philosophy, or Indian, there is called pantheism and panentheism. Or you call this, in the Japanese Far Eastern concepts of Shintoism, you find a kind of sanctity is attached to Mother Nature. So when they look at nature as something sacred and divine, they are not looking at nature at water, soil, roots, mud. No. The whole earth itself becomes a divine concept. If you live like that, then you can become a Vedanti. Mother Earth itself is a manifestation of the absolute, but not as soil and minerals and the coal and all that you excavate, or gold, different metals you excavate. So exploiting nature, digging deeper and deeper, then this Mother Earth can also show her teeth. And we see this happening around. So what you said is true. You stumbled upon a profound truth. Mother Earth itself is a concept. But there, Mother Earth is not a place where you dig in search of coal and minerals. It is a manifestation of the Absolute. That can make you a spiritual person. Whenever you bring a sense of sanctity and sacredness into any concept, that makes you a spiritual person. That's the idea behind. Ultimately, we start moving forward, evolving spiritual life, when we start looking on Mother Earth as a manifestation of the divine. It's not the Mother Earth is making you spiritual. Your higher concept of looking at Earth as something other than a place where you can do whatever you want. That's why in one of the Vedic mantras, it said, Earth is the mother and sun is the father. There is a beautiful poem in Rigveda Samhita. It's called Prithvi Suktam. Prithvi means earth. Sukta means a long hymn. A hymn addressing Mother Earth as a divine manifestation. Okay, thank you for the question.
Hi, Swami. So I understand that, you talked about why is there a God when there's bad things happening, right? Or something to those lines, and then there's something further beyond that, right? But then how does a spiritual person then deal with the injustices in the world that we see around us? Because just because it's impermanent doesn't mean we don't have to deal with what we're seeing in front of us, right?
Yeah. How do we deal with injustices? Yeah, that's right, So philosophy doesn't necessarily make us ineffective or incapable of dealing with the problems of life. Philosophy need not do that. So, but slowly, even an intellectual interest in higher spiritual philosophy will strengthen your mind and your attitude, can bring in an element of balance in the midst of facing problems. It may not solve your worldly problems, but it can equip you with a higher mental power to deal with problems. So remember, problems are problems when we are weak, too weak to face those problems. When we become stronger, problems are lesser problems. So the Vedanta Vedanta tells us that we have to live in this world, we need all these material things, we can't live without those things, it's part of human existence. But at the same time, there is something higher. Not that we should give up all our duties and responsibilities, no. But along with that, we should think of our life from a higher perspective. That perspective will help us. It brings us an element of peace. Again, it doesn't solve your problem. Even God doesn't solve your problem in life. But God gives you something that will help you to look at the problem from a higher perspective, so that problems are not problems. That's an important thing in the psychology, spiritual psychology of prayer. It's a very important principle. It's called the spiritual psychology of prayer and spiritual disciplines. When you practice prayer and discipline, what happens? Our mind gets equipped by God's grace. So we become stronger, strengthened, and we are able to face those problems from a higher perspective. That's what really happens. Otherwise, if we think this world is the only thing that exists, nothing beyond that, then the difficulty is when there is a small little problem, that problem itself can be a devastating problem. That's why mind should be strengthened. Prayer strengthens your mind. In modern times, Arthur Jung, a modern man in search of a soul, some of these psychologists who lived 1930s, 20s, 30s and 40s, just before the Second World War, they said, if there is no God, man has to invent a God. Psychological need. Of course, one way of putting it. Not that God doesn't exist or God is an invention of human being, not at all. The implication is belief in some higher transcendental power has a very important role to play in maintaining mental health, mental balance. So Vedanta or interest, at least intellectual curiosity and interest in higher spiritual philosophy will help and will enrich and strengthen our mind. It will help us to deal with many of the problems which otherwise would be too devastating.
When you say prayer, you're talking about something different from just meditation, right? Prayer as in, or
meditation, prayer can be either.
okay.
You know, in modern times, unless there is a one-to-one conversation, we don't normally talk about what kind of prayer you should do. We don't do that. Mostly we are dealing with philosophy. In direct conversation, we talk about this prayer. But meditation, prayer, in any generals, any tradition will help us. So you can see great mystics in medieval times in Europe, or great Buddhist monks. They also prayed, but they did not believe in a creator God. You know, Buddhism is agnostic, but still they used to pray to Buddha. Buddha took the place of a God in Buddhist tradition. So Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, many of these traditions. Prayer played a very important role because prayer strengthened the human mind. See, when you get vaccination, what is happening is you develop an extra power to withstand the assault of the virus. Vaccine doesn't drive away the virus. Vaccine defends your body. Your immunity is increased, is created. Which means the virus may knock at your door, but your lock is strongly doesn't open. Like the prayer strengthens our mind, our emotions and feelings. So the man like Gandhi, most of the time he was agitating, leading processions. I give the example of Gandhi or Luther King in American context. Any great man in any country who combined some kind of spiritual disciplines, prayer meeting, Gandhi's case. So how could he do that? He was always calm and quiet. You don't find Gandhi making big show in the street. And he was always running processions, but he was calm and quiet and tranquil. Because I'm giving an example. From an unlikely background, he was not a saint in the normal conventional sense, but a politician, but saintly politician. You find many such people. Faith in some higher power always helped them to remain calm and quiet and tranquil, even in the most unlikely circumstances. In Gandhi's case, political agitations. So prayer has got a unique power. It creates an armor and it helps you to withstand difficulties. That's right. Okay, thank you for the question. So we will continue. Any more questions? We'll continue our discussion next week. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.